these won't be surprising to you, I don't think, the topic, but I think maybe the scope and just thinking about what some of the implications will be for the city and for the people who live here is what we're going to get into today. Okay, so the first thing I want to talk about is just how are we growing as a state, and how has St. Paul been growing in terms of its population growth, and what do we expect for the future. So let's take a look at what we've seen. In recent years, we've seen a lot of growth in the urban counties of Ramsey and Hennepin. So you can see the very darkest areas of this map are showing you where we've seen counties that have grown between 10,000 and about 60,000 people in those 4 years, which is a lot of growth. You know, in the past, what we saw is, you know, in the early part of the 19th century and afterwards, we saw growth coming out from the center cities, from Minneapolis and St. Paul, and then out to the suburbs, and then out to the outer ring suburbs, and then out to the exurbs. And even around 2000, we were still seeing a tremendous amount of growth in those exurban counties. And so if you don't know what exurbs means, think about like a Home Depot right next to a pasture. That's kind of like, if you think about those communities that are just growing very, very rapidly, and they didn't seem to be there yesterday, and now they're there. That's kind of the growth pattern, but we've seen something that's a bit different. And you can see here, this is kind of the regions of our state, and this line up at the top, the kind of light blue line, is showing you the exurban growth. And since 2000, it's really started to decline. And Hennepin and Ramsey, which are the lines, the line in red, has begun to grow. And so now, our state is growing, different regions of our state, it's roughly growing at the same rate. But Hennepin and Ramsey in particular has really picked up compared to the early part of the 2000s. I should have said, if you have questions as I go, please feel free to stop me. I'm happy to take them as we go. But there is time at the end too for more in-depth questions and for discussion. So just flag me if you have a question, if something's not clear that I'm showing you. Okay, so this isn't a trend that is specific to the Twin Cities metropolitan area. It's happening across the U.S. The Brookings Institution looked at all the metropolitans, the big metropolitans across the U.S., and they said pretty much the same thing is happening there, maybe a little bit later than it happened here, but those emerging suburbs, those exurbs as I called them, are not growing as fast as they used to, and we're seeing a big pickup in the dense suburbs and center cities after the recession and after the housing crisis. So this is what St. Paul looks like in terms of its population growth long term. So we're starting here in 1850, one of the earliest years we have census data for, and you can see that growth just continued up until about 1950, and that's where it kind of stalled. It declined a bit in the 70s. What I want you to, if we go to the next slide, what's kind of remarkable, this is just zooming in on the most recent period, is that there's been a tremendous amount of growth in just the last 5 years. And so you can see, you know, especially if we look back to 1950, we haven't seen this level of growth, you know, in the last 50 years. This is something that's been pretty remarkable in just a very short period of time. Minneapolis and St. Paul now top the list of cities in terms of numeric growth. So since the last census between 2010 and 2014, which is the most recent year we have data for, estimates for, St. Paul added 15,000 people to its population. Minneapolis added 28,000. I don't know if you remember, you probably don't, because why would you pay attention to this, but between the last two censuses, between 2000 and 2010, Minneapolis added about 30 people. So that whole decade, they were all excited for their census number, and it came out, and they're like, wah, 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 30 people. But since that time, I mean, you can see, a tremendous amount of growth since that time, in St. Paul as well. And so this is a bit of a reversal of a trend that we've been seeing in just stable growth in St. Paul. So is this going to keep going on into the future? That's kind of the question, right? What's driving that growth in the center cities? People talk about transportation costs. People don't want to live far away from job centers. They talk about preferences of millennials, that they want to live in mixed-use neighborhoods. One thing that you don't hear as much about that I want to bring to your attention is that there are a heck of a lot of people who are millennials, who are in their late 20s right now. And we're looking here at the state's population, ages 15 and above. And you can see that there's a big bump right around age 25 to 29. That's a big cohort of people, a big generation, the millennials. You can see there's a big bump around 50 to 70-ish. Those are the baby boomers. Not so many people in the middle. Those are Gen Xers that we even forget exist. That are very rare. I don't know, if you see a 40-year-old, take a selfie with them, I guess, because it's rare, a rare sighting. But do I see a hand over here? I'm keeping my hands low, even though I might fit that description. So think about who the millennials are, where they are in their life, and what the economic conditions are that they've been facing recently. We know that they have delayed a lot of what we would call the transitions to adulthood is kind of how we talk about it normally. So household formation, home ownership, partnership, having children, becoming parents, all those kinds of transitions have been delayed. And I think we need to be thinking about that in terms of residential preferences, that there's this huge cohort of people who have a lifestyle, who have a living arrangement or a family situation that lends itself very easily to living in a central city. And the question for cities that are like St. Paul, Minneapolis and St. Paul in particular, is it going to be the kind of place that this huge cohort of people are going to buy a home and settle into and raise a family in, or are they going to move to a different location, to a different suburb, usually is the pattern that we see. Just for clarification, this is showing you that there is a pretty big cohort of young people in their late 20s who are renters, and that typically declines after about 20. We start seeing home ownership. So there may be some kind of pent-up demand for, as we've been seeing even in the housing market lately. The green section, non-householders, those are people who are either living with someone who's in an owned household, so a spouse of an owner or a renter, or they're living in a different arrangement. It may be with parents, it may be, it wouldn't be with a roommate because they'd be here in renters or in the homeowner household. But this is just to give you a sense of households. I've split it up that way. So it's kind of a big generation that's just kind of set to make their choice. I think people tend to think that the behavior that we've seen from millennials in terms of where they've chosen to live and how they choose to move about the city, the transportation choices that we have, are kind of a fixed preference within that generation. That may be true to some extent, but I think we don't take into account enough that they're at a point in their life that is pretty pivotal in terms of some of these residential choices and transitions to older adulthood, middle adulthood. So I did not answer the question about will the growth continue, but those are things to think about. These are things I think about when I'm looking at it. Okay, so if you're a demographer and you're giving a talk on demographics, you have to they make you talk about aging. I don't know who they is, but aging is the big trend, right? You've all heard about it. You've been hearing about it for decades, and I think we talk about it and hear about it so much that it almost seems like it's forever going to be 10 years away or 15 years away or 30 years away. But I want to give you a sense for where we are in that transition right now, and then what some of the implications of that transition will be. Are you still hearing me okay back there?
It's really great when you can keep it close to your mouth.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, like that.
Yeah.
Okay. So, sorry, guys.
No, I apologize.
Okay. So this is 100 years of aging on this axis. And what this graph is telling you is that in each decade, we added to the state of Minnesota somewhere between about 50,000 and 90,000 additional older adults, people who were age 65 plus. The population in the state has been growing.
You have to tip it.
Oh, tip it? I feel like I have to be like, you have to have your leg up and your arm and your elbow up. I don't know. The population in the state has been growing, and so the older adult population has grown. So what do you think this is going to look like this decade? And don't guess lower, it's a terrible guess. Higher. Double maybe? Okay, let's look at the next slide. So we're gonna, yeah, I know. So we're adding 300,000 additional older adults almost this decade. It's already 2016, right? So this isn't something that is way out there anymore. And on top of that, 300,000 next decade during the 20s. So this next 15 years is really pivotal in terms of this demographic transition. The baby boomers are crossing over that 65-year-old age mark. So we have, if you look at the numbers to 2014 in this decade, the most recent numbers, we already added 100,000. So we surpassed all other decades in just 4 years. When we make projections like this, we take into account people moving away, people moving in, people passing away, going to the great beyond. These are things that we roll into our projections. My predecessor, who was in this role for 30 plus years, always liked to tell people that we have a theory on average that we age 1 year every 12 months. I know, right? Which is to say, I would like to draw that out because this is to say that this transition is going to continue to unfold. We're going to continue to age just as sure as we are about that we're going to age, right? So it's not a difficult projection to make. The people who are here now are the people who are going to be here in 10 years, more or less. And so this transition is going to happen whether or not we're ready for it. Right now, baby boomers are still relatively young. They started turning 65 in 2011. So we're just beginning to see them turn 65. So the impacts that we're experiencing really have to do with transitions out of the labor force and less about the other kinds of things that we think about when we think about health and how do we care for older adults. It's really focused right now. The aging issue is really impacting labor force growth. And so I want to show you what that looks like. I think that's my next slide. Oh, nope. First, I just wanted to tell you this little fact about ourselves, which is important in terms of when we think about public budgets. That is that for the first time in our state's history, we will have more children ages 5 to 17 or in K-12 education. We'll have more 65 plus than that group right there, than 5 to 17. So the 65-year-old and older, the older adults, will surpass the school-age population for the first time. So when you think about public budgets, especially at the state level, if you look at the general fund, a lot of the budget is going to K-12 education, and there's going to become more budget pressures because of that older adult population, particularly in the health and human services side of things. It doesn't mean that there's necessarily going to be a trade-off. There's efficiencies to be gained, perhaps. There's gains in productivity that could reduce costs. But it is going to be a shift in terms of the people who are living in our communities and who are participating in programs. It's just going to be kind of more of the more expensive age groups in terms of public budgets. That's just how it goes. So I don't think we're going to hear a bell ring or anything when these two lines pass. It's only 4 years away, but it's going to be something like building pressure, I think. So as we have more and more people in some of these more expensive kind of budget categories, that pressure on public budgets will continue to grow. Yeah.
I'm guessing this is what makes those at the federal level nervous from a Social Security standpoint.
Yeah, so the comment was that this is what makes those nervous at the federal level with Social Security. Yeah, this is one of the issues, and even at the state level, when we look at MA, medical assistance spending, especially in the area of long-term care, this is something that we're going to have to really figure out as we go forward, because right now, kind of the path we're on isn't sustainable. So, okay, so labor force. This has pretty big implications for the city as an organization. In the past, the labor force was growing wildly and we didn't even know it. It was just normal. In the 1990s and in the 2000s, it would grow by, say in the 1990s, 38,000 people each year during that decade, or 380,000 over the course of the decade. Even over the course when we had the Great Recession, it was still growing by 25,000 people on average each year during that decade. This decade, we only expect the labor force to grow by about 8,000 people each year, or 80,000 over the course of the whole decade. And next decade, it's even slower. That's because we have so many baby boomers who are moving into retirement. We've adjusted for baby boom. When we make these projections, we adjust for baby boomers staying in the labor force longer. But even adjusting for that, we still see a tremendous slowdown. It really doesn't make a big difference in terms of the overall picture. So what does that mean to organizations? We're already starting to see news stories, right, about how it's hard to find people. We have to bus people in from other places. We need to think differently. I saw an article about the Mall of America working with a social service organization to incorporate homeless people into their workforce at the Mall of America. So people are already beginning to think differently. But we're just partway here on this bar, right? And we've already begun to see the slowdown. On average, the first 4 years, we've only added 10,000 people during that time, and it'll continue to slow to average out to that 8,000. So this is something that we are in the midst of, and it's something that we're likely to see continue for the foreseeable future. This isn't a temporary situation. This is slow labor force growth. And I want to reiterate that it is not that the labor force is going to shrink. It's going to keep growing, but it's just going to grow at a very, very slow rate, potentially constraining job growth. Yeah?
To be clear, this is because the number of baby boomers leaving the workforce rather than the lack of people entering the workforce.
Well, it's kind of a combination. So you're right. This is kind of why we're slowing down. But we also have a history here in Minnesota, a recent history since about 2000, of losing more people to other states than we gain. We make up for it with international immigration, that we fully compensate our domestic losses of people moving away. But that puts us just barely positive in terms of net migration. So we don't have a lot of boost to our state growth because of migration. It really kind of is close to a wash when you look at both domestic flows and international flows. So it's partly a situation, some states in the southwest of the US are growing very, very rapidly. They're not going to see this same pattern because they have a lot of young people coming in. So it's partly has to do with that, but a lot of it has to do with a huge cohort leaving the labor force. The millennials we saw earlier is a huge cohort as well, but it's not enough to both replace the baby boomers leaving and also provide growth on top of that for the economy to keep growing.
You kind of answered it. I was just wondering what else, if this is happening nationally or, but you answered that one.
Yeah, so this is happening globally, it's happening nationally. There are areas of the US and there are countries where it's not the case, but it's really just the outcome of population aging. It happens because you have long life expectancies and a low birth rate. Eventually, this is what you get, is a very slow growing population and a very slow growing labor force. Yeah?
Do we know why people in the labor force ages in the state are leaving?
So why are people of working age leaving?
Right.
We did a report on this a couple years ago. It was called Minnesota on the Move, and we looked at who are the people that are leaving to the extent that we could. Most of the migration to and from the state happens when people are 18, 19, 20-year-olds. So they're going away to school, they're going away to, find a new place, just find adventure, I don't know, find a new place to live. 2/3 of the young people who are moving are going away to school. Many of them come back, but it doesn't appear that they all come back, and we know it just anecdotally that that time of life can be a springboard on to other places. Okay, I think we can move on here. So I want to think about St. Paul in terms of this aging trend. I've talked about some of the big macro level kinds of things that are going to affect the city as an organization as you look for employees. In terms of funding flows, state and federal funding, that's likely to be a factor in the future. But St. Paul is relatively young compared to other cities around the state. The older cities tend to be in greater Minnesota. Excuse me. But right now, just 9% of St. Paul residents are 65 and above. And because we've seen that growth in recent years, we can go to the next one. Because we've seen a lot of growth in recent years, and young people tend to be the people who move, tend to be the people who have babies, that's why you see actual decline in the last couple of decades in the number 65 plus. So it's a very different picture at this city level. It's a different picture, and that's not to say that this will continue. because you still have baby boomers living here in St. Paul, so that number will grow. But it's just very different when you look from city to city or you look at the state level. It's not that those state level factors, those aging factors, won't impact you. It just might not be in the way that you immediately think. You're likely to have a population that will grow, an older adult population that will grow, like all cities, but you also have these flows of young people into the city that other areas don't have. It's not that aging, I don't want to say that aging is not a big issue for St. Paul. It sure will be, and you sure will have more older adults than you have in the past. I just wanted to put some context around it relative to other places, relative to the state as a whole. The issues around aging may be different. You'll feel those labor force issues regardless of how many residents are 65 plus here in St. Paul. That's going to be, you probably already are experiencing some of those issues. Okay, so I want to show you what we look like with respect to racial and ethnic diversity, cultural diversity in the state, just so you get a sense for that, and in St. Paul in particular. So we've seen growth in populations of color mostly since 1990. We have seen an increase in immigration since that time. And while we're still much less diverse than the US overall, this line is showing you people of color. That means they would have gotten a census form or survey, and they would have said that they are American Indian, Asian, African American or Black, Hispanic or Latino, or a combination of those with white. So that's been growing roughly at the same rate as the US, but we kind of began at a lower starting point, close to 1% in 1960. So there's been a lot of growth in recent decades in a relatively short period of time in demographic terms. Demographics tends to move very slowly, and you can see it coming for decades. But this is where we are now statewide. The growth has been roughly equal in terms of Asians, Hispanic or Latinos, and Black or African Americans in the state. Each of those are reaching up close to or surpassed about 300,000, and jointly populations of color and American Indians have reached just recently 1 million or 19%. In the most recent number, 19% of the population in the state. I think it's going down again. Okay.
I have a new one, I hope. On
So in St. Paul, part of what's been driving this diversity has been international immigration. And in St. Paul, 18% of your residents were born in another country. Nearly 1 in 5. That's pretty remarkable. When compared even to Minneapolis, in terms of that kind of diversity, cultural diversity, and much more, many more foreign-born in St. Paul than the state overall, of course. We can go to the next. I wanted to give you a sense of where St. Paul fits with respect to its kind of joint populations of color. We'll look a little bit more specifically in a moment at specific groups, but there are about 132,000 people of color in St. Paul, or 41% of all St. Paul residents, which is a very high percentage compared to other cities. But you can see that almost 1 in 10 people of color in the state of Minnesota live in St. Paul. So you've got that geographic kind of concentration of populations of color right here. Okay. Just to give you a sense of your racial, cultural makeup, that's a little tough to read. The red section, this kind of red section here is Black or African American. And you can see that St. Paul is much more likely to be a population of color, this side of the pie, than the state overall. and has a slightly higher percentage of Asian residents than the state overall. What's unique about Minnesota's history and our populations of color is that we have a large population of refugees coming to Minnesota, and have for some time, since the late 70s. We have had faith-based and social service organizations that have kind of stepped up and helped resettle refugees coming out of wars in Southeast Asia. And then, are we going to try another one?
We're going to trade and hope for the best.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks. Ooh, that was better. So we have a higher than average proportion of our foreign-born population that are refugees. And here, this is the state overall, but we did a recent report called The Economic Status of Minnesotans, and looked at specific groups in the census data to the extent that we can. And you can just get a sense for what our largest groups are when we're not just looking by race. Now, African American in this kind of categorization are people who were born in the US and also have US born parents. And then we've included the children of different cultural groups, the US-born children, in with their foreign-born parent, if they have one or two parents foreign-born. Yeah.
Good question. If you were to draw out the population versus like where they're coming from, is it still like that nice bell curve?
The population versus, tell me more.
So sorry. Are we skewing younger for minority population?
Oh, yes. Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
So how drastic is that?
Yeah. So in this, we have this report online on our site, which is Demography. It's .gov, Minnesota.gov/demography. And it's called The Economic Status of Minnesotans, and we have median age in there. And some populations most populations of color are much younger than the white non-Hispanic population. The median age for Somalis in particular, and I'm thinking Hmong as well, is close to about 20 years old. So you have half the population under 20. So it's a tremendous difference from that picture of aging that I was just showing you, that very different in terms of age distribution and of growth rates as well. Yeah, yeah. Okay, so we can go on. I just wanted to give you a sense that we're not talking, when I start talking about people of color or broad racial groups, we're talking about kind of people clumsily grouped together under those racial categories, that there's a lot more diversity going on within those groups than we oftentimes are aware of or talk about. So our projections going forward is we'll continue to see this growth. And we'll continue to see growth, particularly among Asian populations, Black, Hispanic, or Latino, in the labor force. So just the working age years in the last 4 years, we've begun to decline in terms of our white non-Hispanic population. And our populations of color have compensated for that decline. So we're already seeing kind of a transition in some areas of life in some age groups. We can go to the next one because it gives you a sense of this age distribution that you were talking about. This is what we look like as a state, and this orange portion is showing you populations of color. And so you can see as you go down that pyramid, I don't know if you can see, that's not showing up very well, I'm sorry. There's very, very small populations of color in their 70s, in their 60s. That group that's moving out of the labor force is largely white non-Hispanic. The group that's moving into the labor force in the next 5 years, if you think about this graph like it's an escalator, and every 5 years everyone moves up a bar, and again every 5 years everyone moves up a bar, you can see that we'll continue to become more diverse in our workforce just because of people aging in and out of those working years. Just because the people moving into the workforce at the younger years are much more diverse than those moving out. And similarly, we're going to become more diverse as a state and as a city, different communities, because we have more people of color who are of parenting age. And so no matter what happens with international immigration coming up, whether we see more of it or whether we see less of it, we'll just continue to become more diverse just because we have that internal dynamic built into our age structure. So what does this mean? I think I have one more slide here. Whew, there's a lot of changes coming. The age changes with respect to diversity. I mean, we've been hearing about and experiencing so many racial tensions in the last month or two, or even the last year. You know, I think we need to know that going forward, these issues are issues that we're going to have to resolve, that we're going to have to figure out a way to get through and come to a satisfying condition for everyone. The changes that are happening with respect to diversity, with respect to aging, maybe less so with respect to the first kind of group of slides that I showed you on how we're growing as a state, is going to happen regardless of whether or not we're ready for them and our institutions are appropriate for them and our policies are appropriate for them. So our job is really just to figure out how we realign what we have going here, our whole community, to this new demographic reality. I don't think it has to be scary that it has to change. I think we have an opportunity to put into place things, policies, institutions, communities that work better for everyone and not just a portion of all residents. So I think I'm very hopeful about the changes that these demographic shifts will kind of bring on. I don't think it has to be a scary thing, but it is going to change whether or not we're ready for it. So with that, I'm happy to take questions or comments. Yes, I saw a hand over here.
So Susan, 2 slides earlier when you showed the growth of populations of color, and then you talked about some of that will be driven by birth. Do you have a sense of how much of that growth will be driven by birth, how much will be driven by either immigration or people relocating from other states?
Sure. Right now, the majority of our growth is coming from births each year, and the majority of growth is coming from births to populations of color. Well, it's about roughly equal at the state level right now. White births still outnumber, but in terms of the birth rate, it's a little bit higher among populations of color. What's going to happen because of our age structure going forward is that we will need to see more immigration to make up for a declining, what we call natural change. So we'll need to see either more births or more migration to continue to grow. So right now, most of what's happening is births that are driving that growth. But we do have a steady flow of immigration as well. I can show you specific numbers too if you want quantities, but yeah. Yeah.
Can you explore, talk a little bit about the relationship between the millennials, because they're going to be the workforce of the future, and the diversity of the millennials?
Sure.
Right now what we're seeing is kind of overall.
Right, so millennials go up to about age 30 from about age 18. Actually, there's not really a end point at this point, but roughly in here you can see we're we're close to 20% of that group are populations of color. And I think that's interesting because people don't talk about millennials and their preferences. I don't think they talk about the diversity a lot. So we're talking about a group of young people that's more diverse than ever before, maybe different preferences, different experiences with our institutions, different, in particular with our educational system, different barriers to employment, particularly if they're coming from backgrounds that are economically disadvantaged. So I think there's potentially more vulnerability in terms of the jumping off point. But the other side of that, for the younger generation as compared to the baby boomers, but the other side of that is there's also more untapped potential that we just haven't quite figured out as communities how to kind of lift up, I guess.
Well, and I'd like to follow that up with a little bit, just a statement on the realigning that you mentioned in your last slide. I think from the standpoint of realignment, we can't do much with the boomer bubble because that's got its own momentum going through right now, basically. But there would be, it seemed to me, a higher likelihood of realigning such that we catch the millennials going through. Does that make any sense?
So in terms of
realigning diversity, for instance, or realigning our workforce goals.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
That type of situation.
Yeah, and I think the comparison we need to think about is just that the diversity in our workplaces is helped along just by that replacement thing that I talked about, the baby boomers largely white leaving. And so when you're thinking about diversity goals as an organization, you need to be thinking about that kind of rapid transition that's going to happen. And it's not because we don't know how much growth there will be. We already know these folks are already here and they're just aging into those working years. Yeah.
I saw you speak at the BOMA lunch.
Oh, yeah.
And you talked a bit about how employers need to get more creative with the, given that the workforce population or the labor force isn't growing as much as it has in the past.
Yeah.
I think you alluded to competition between employers.
Yeah.
And thinking about how that impacts benefits that are offered and policies. Could you speak a little bit?
Sure. So when we're in a condition of really slow labor force growth, and particularly right now where we have close to full employment, and we're looking forward and we see very little growth going forward, that sets up a climate of intense competition for workers. And so I think it's going to be organizations' jobs to look, well, I don't know if it's their jobs, but it's going to serve them well if they look very carefully at the way that they recruit and retain people. If the people that they are bringing into their organization really need the credentials that we say they need. I know that's something that we kind of build up these walls over time because we have a higher and higher bar. Maybe we don't need to have such a high bar for some of the jobs in terms of a specific certificate, a specific work experience. Maybe we open up kind of our minds to the fact that people who weren't trained specifically in A or worked in the past in B can also do a fine job at whatever it is. There are groups of people who historically have been left out of the labor force or for whom working hasn't made sense economically because they have other things going on in life. So populations of color in particular who have been marginalized, how do we incorporate more people younger into productive work? People with disabilities, how do we make workplaces that fit well with whatever the disability requires? Parents, how do we allow mothers or fathers who want to be home and meet the bus after school to be there and also work when they can? Kind of what we would think of now as kind of a funny work day, but you're done at two, and you know, all these kinds of things I think we haven't thought about in the past because we haven't needed to, but I think we need to start thinking about how can we find people and offer them whatever it is that they need to put in whatever work they want to be able to contribute. So, is that what you were thinking? That one? Okay, thanks.
Susan?
Yeah.
How does Minnesota compare to other states in regards to ratios of people of color? I would imagine the borders and the coasts.
Oh,
would be higher.
yeah.
But how many other states are like Minnesota?
So you're right. If you look at a map of populations of color in the U.S., the entire kind of southern part of the U.S. from West Coast to East Coast is much more concentrated with populations of color. A lot of that has been driven by migration from Mexico, but not all of it. When you look at Midwestern states, it's very different state to state. If the state has a large metropolitan area, then you see much more diversity. So much less so in some of the plain states, although they do have larger populations that are Native American Indians. But by and large, you know, there's a kind of middle part of the U.S. that has historically been more white and is becoming browner over the decades. And it's helped along, as I said, if you have a metropolitan area and one that's growing, to bring in new people. Yeah.
I'm wondering if there are places that you know of that have done a better job of adapting to demographic change. Like if you have a sense of what are some of the characteristics of places that do a better job of adapting versus
Yeah, so the question is, are there places that do a better job of adapting to demographic change? There are some places that have been at it longer. There are some places that have different populations. We hear in Minnesota that we have the worst economic, racial disparities in the nation. And again, there was a Politico article on it, I think just this week. I think that is something that is true for some indicators. We can see it in labor force participation. We can see it on time high school graduation, that we have very large gaps. But I don't think that it is that we know whether it's across the board as much as we're saying we know that it's across the board. Some measures show that we are very segregated residentially. Others say we're doing pretty well on that. So I think that the data still need to be examined further to really get a better sense of if that really is the case. I think that our disparities are the largest across the board. They're very serious here. They're serious, you know, if they exist, they're serious. Other places just have a different history, I would say, so I don't know. I don't know that I can say that anyone's done it specifically better with respect to diversity. With respect to aging, we're kind of rock stars apparently compared to other places. We've been ahead of the curve in terms of keeping people in their homes, in terms of kind of making the changes to be able to keep people out of nursing homes as long as possible, which is a win-win situation. So we've really done very, very well. And a lot of what we've done to prepare for aging, is it enough? Probably not. There's probably more coming, but in terms of that, we really do stand out compared to other states. Yeah?
For whatever reason, there's an inability of the school districts to distinguish between East African and African American in their statistics.
Yeah.
I guess this is a twofold question. One, why do they continue to do it? And then secondly, my guess is that the dynamics of both those groups would be fairly different if they were
Yeah.
considered
Yeah.
separately.
So if you look at that report that I was talking about, the economic status of Minnesotans, and we break out newer African immigrants from U.S.-born blacks or African Americans, you do see differences, a lot of differences across many indicators. In terms of the school data, there was just this last session legislation put in place saying that they are required to break out groups specifically, and so we've just begun working with MDE to figure out what the best way is to do that.
What was the logic in the first place, other than convenience?
To have it all together. I think it's just because race has been, up until recently, sufficient, again, I'm speaking in demographic terms. Recently is 20 years in my head when I say recently. The major race groups, Asian, African American, American Indian, Hispanic or Latino, was probably sufficient to describe that community, but there's been so much immigration in the last 20 years and so much diversity that's grown within those groups that they've become insufficient to really be able to tell what's going on with any particular person within that group. That's particularly true if you look at Asian communities, where you have Asian Indians, 85% of whom have a bachelor's degree or higher, mixed in with Southeast Asian communities who, when you break them out, as we did in our report, you can see that there's many more barriers that are kind of masked by that group. But the same is true of African communities as well. Yeah. Yeah.
So the older end of the spectrum of millennials that are already starting to have families and buy homes, is there any indication or is there any data saying if they're staying in the major metro areas or if they're doing kind of like their parents did and moving to the suburbs? Correct.
Yeah, no, that's exactly what I'm watching right now. I don't think that there's always a lag in data, right? So the stuff that I showed you is pretty much what I know up until now. And then I watch to see, do we see growth in those suburban areas of, it's typically 30-year-olds who are, close to 30 now, who are buying homes, who are having children, who are potentially resettling. I mean, I think if we think about the connection between school districts and the health of a district's schools and its population growth, it's a pretty strong connection, particularly of people who are set to buy homes. If you talk to anyone who has children who's looking to buy a home, a school district is among, the top thing that people are thinking about. If their kids are anywhere close to that, of course there's price, but if you're thinking about location, people think school district. So I think we need to think in terms of a city's growth is just what's going on with the schools as well, because that will determine a lot about whether millennials will choose to stay in some cities, I think. Well, y'all have been lovely. Thank you. Sorry I was late. Yeah. Good.
Thank you so much, Susan. This was such a wonderful presentation, such valuable information for everybody who is here today. At each of your tables, there is a sheet of paper. I think there's just one per table that says your key takeaways. We would love to hear from you in writing what you see as your key takeaways. So maybe just rotate that around your table to write down your key takeaways. But before we actually leave today, we would love to hear from a few of you about what your key takeaways are and how you might be using the information that you learned today back in your workforce or back in your job that you have. Any volunteers? Yes.
So, Michael Cookta from District 10 Como Community Council, and the reason I'm here is because
Why don't I give you the microphone?
so I can twist it and stuff.
Yeah.
Michael Cookta, District 10 Como Community Council. So, the reason I'm here is to try to see if I can deduce how demographic trends are playing out in our neighborhood. And Obviously, we don't have that kind of a breakdown from Susan that I'm aware of. Maybe she could break down my district for me. But anecdotally, it seems that we're kind of on the cusp of both trends. We are seeing growth in young families in our neighborhood, and we're also seeing the aging of baby boomers. We're contiguous to Roseville. I don't think we have 21% of our population over age 65, but we do have a significant portion of baby boomers in our community. So that plays, that from a district council perspective and the things we need to pursue, that creates different policy challenges for us and different kind of things that we need to pursue economically, need to pursue from quality of life. So that's my takeaway.
And if we could hear from one or two more people, but Susan, I have a question for you. Is there a good website for people to go to find demographic information?
So we have a lot of demographic information on our website, which is up there. Another great resource at the community level is called Minnesota Compass, and that's where I came from before I came to the state. So they have neighborhood level, or maybe at this level, district council level, demographic information that they update continuously. So that's another great place to look.
Yeah, I've been on that site. It's wonderful because you can customize it the way you want.
Yeah, it's mncompass.org.
Okay, one or two more key takeaways. Yes.
I thought it was interesting that St. Paul is a young city, because I think from the comments that we tend to get on our projects and the people who are involved in public engagement, it feels like we're an old city.
One more? That's another, can I just comment on that? I mean, that's another thing to think about is how do we get input from people? So, you know, what 20-year-old's going to show up to a meeting to like stand at the, I know there's some of them, but it doesn't, it's not the same draw. I think we need to be thinking about other ways of getting that input.
Susan, have you heard of pop-up meetings? Have you heard of pop-up meetings?
No.
Oh, well, some people here can tell you all about them. It's getting at the younger generation. Did you have a comment?
Tell her about pop-ups.
Can you tell her about pop-ups or something?
You can tell me later. You don't have to tell me.
Okay, I'll tell you later about it. I just know that there's like even a bike and they bike around and they collect survey data.
Love
And,
that.
and you get popsicles.
I do have one takeaway, and that is I'm on the racial equity change team for the Planning and Economic Development Department, and I know all of the departments have their own change team, and one of the things that we've really been focusing on is how do we get out and how do we talk to young people in high school, and maybe even we need to start in the junior high level, but to let them know like what kinds of jobs even exist at the city of St. Paul, and what does it mean to work in a city, and like no matter what your interests are, there's probably a job for you in the city of St. Paul. So I think that we should, if we can, all be thinking about every opportunity, because like high schools have student job fairs, and I had a group of kids come down the other day from Cycles for Change because they just wanted to come down and find out what's happening in the bike world at the city. But it was, you know, they all come down and it's like, oh, so this is the city, you know, and it's sort of like Oz, but not really. Anyway, but so I really feel like your presentation has just so driven that home, that we really need to be reaching out to young people who don't even know what the city is, you know, so thank you so much for that.
And thank you, Margaret. And thank everyone for coming to this meeting today. To tag on to what you just said, Margaret, the city finally has in their budget a city recruiter, and she's in the room today. Maybe she'll even raise her hand. It's new change. And I know that in each department there's recruiters too, and I think it's just at the beginning of really getting out there, so your comment was really important. So thank you all very much, and have a great day.
Thanks, Susan.
Thank you.